AAA RPGs are in a weird space right now, and I want to talk about it. But first, I need to point out that AAA isn't actually a term with a set definition, which has made researching for this video an absolute nightmare. Now, you may well believe you already know what a AAA developer is. Feel free to let me know in the comments. But to emphasise my point a little, I'm going to list 5 different development studios. Bethesda, Larian, From Software, Ubisoft, and Obsidian. You probably have already made up your mind on whether they're AAA or not as I was listing them, but for each of those studios I've seen arguments for and against, with no real consensus. I asked my friends what they thought a AAA studio is, and the best answer we could get was big studio with big budget. As soon as any talk of quality or known names came into the picture, things got real muddy. And so, for this video, when I'm talking about AAA games or AAA studios, I'm really just talking about large corporate entities who have spent a lot of money on making the game. With all that in mind, I want to start talking about the perceived decline in the AAA RPG industry. Back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, we were pretty much getting an incredible RPG every single year. This was the era of Dark Souls, Mass Effect 2, Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto 5, The Witcher 3, the list just goes on and on and on. Not only were these critically acclaimed games, but they were also vast open world RPGs that provided hundreds of hours of engaging content. And we were getting these every single year. Oftentimes, multiple per year. But now that the video game industry is bigger and more mainstream than ever before, it seems like this golden age of RPGs has come to an end. It's not that we don't get any good games anymore, but it feels like we're not getting universally praised games year in and year out. Either we have a year which doesn't seem to have a big RPG release into it, or when the release does happen, it gets mixed reviews for one reason or another. So far in the 2020s, the only RPGs I can think of which have been received with overwhelming praise have been Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate 3. Obviously, these games are both masterpieces in their own right, and show that the RPG industry certainly isn't dead. But the fact we've gone from being able to list multiple games a year which were beloved, to now only hitting one every other year, does make it feel like things are headed in the wrong direction. At this point I'm sure that many of you are thinking about how games in the old days were just flat out better than what gets released now, but that's not entirely true. While there certainly are many old games that are just objectively better than modern releases, it's by no means a rule of thumb. When looking at the best rank RPGs of the previous decade, we still had games that were broken on launch, or which had plenty of poor writing, or which just included some bad gameplay design. The biggest thing which has changed is our expectations as players. We had all these great, albeit somewhat flawed games in the past. As time keeps marching on, we get technological improvements, the industry grows, and development studios get bigger. Every company keeps trying to convince us that their game is the next big thing, because this one has 17 times the graphical fidelity, or a map that's 10 times larger than we've ever seen before. With marketing like this, it's no surprise that we as the players keep setting the bar higher, but it is becoming a problem. Companies are raising the bar for their teams, while often under-delivering from what we saw in the past. If a studio makes a game which is comparable in quality, or even just a little worse than the previous game, it's not that big a deal. But when they do this after the marketing has bragged about how much better it is than anything you've seen before, well then it suddenly feels like the game is a whole lot worse than it actually is. You can't just build unrealistic levels of hype and then deliver a lukewarm product. I actually want to go over several different studios and talk about their current standing, but before I do that I've got to throw in a quick tangent, as I couldn't find another place for it. New RPGs are revealed way too early. I hate how many companies decide they want to build up the hype train half a decade before their game is even due to come out. Elder Scrolls 6 is probably the king of this, with the announcement trailer being over 6 years old, and estimates of the game's actual release still not being for multiple years, but it's barely an outlier. The new Fable game is looking at a 5-year gap between announcement and actual release, and pretty much the shortest window between reveal trailers and actual planned release date I can find is for GTA 6, which lands at a not so snug 2-year range. As far as I'm concerned, I think you should only be allowed a maximum of a year between your announcement trailer and the planned release date. Trying to build up hype for a game over multiple years just doesn't work. I really don't even get what the purpose is. All the excitement gets drained away and people are just left with a bad taste towards the game from the start, as they've had to wait too long for it. At best, you do keep people excited for all those years, and then the player base goes in with too high expectations and is left disappointed. And at worst, people get over your game before it's even close to coming out, already having used up any excitement for it long before it's playable, and then passing it over when the release date actually arrives. It's a real peeve of mine in the modern video game industry, and I don't see a sensible reason for it to keep happening. Okay, I've got that off my chest, let's start talking about some different studios. And considering what I was just talking about, let's kick things off with Ubisoft. Because Ubisoft, or Ubisoft, apologies people who care about that, Ubisoft makes sure that we get a brand new RPG every 2 or 3 years at most. They're pumping out games at a pretty constant rate, and ensuring that we aren't in a complete drought for new releases. And I can kind of appreciate that. Unfortunately, this is pretty much the only big positive point I'm putting towards the company, as overall they're quite negatively regarded. The Ubisoftification of games is something you'll hear about from time to time, which basically talks about how most of their games tend to feel quite formulaic and samey. They rarely innovate in any way, and will tend to be a pretty similar experience to whatever the last game of theirs was that you played. Now, this isn't an entirely bad thing, as elements like familiar controls and easy to understand mechanics are good for the player, and not looking to redesign the wheel with each new game helps the games to release faster. But it does lead to the kind of problem where, if you've played one of them, you've played them all. I personally quite enjoy the Far Cry games, and I had a blast playing through both 5 and New Dawn, but when it came to Far Cry 6, I didn't end up clicking with many of the characters, and the overall story wasn't anything fresh, so I gave up on the game halfway through. I'd already had my fill of the franchise with those past 2 entries, so why stick with a new one if it's got nothing to give? Of course, with new games coming out all the time, in large part thanks to just how many studios are under the Ubisoft umbrella, it's not a disaster for them if a game doesn't excel. They can afford to have the odd game underperform, as they've got the next one right around the corner. Their latest big flop came in the form of Star Wars Outlaws, which was routinely mocked online for a huge array of bugs, underwhelming mechanics, and the fact they decided to include mandatory stealth in a modern open world RPG. The idiots. It was a big game and a big failure, albeit one which apparently is getting fixed as time goes by. See the mandatory stealthing, which apparently is no longer an issue. Better late than never. In general though, Ubisoft games seem to pretty regularly be deemed as fine. They've kind of carved themselves out of space in the modern AAA RPG industry as the company which makes okay games, and not much else of positive to say there. Honestly, I think this is something that the industry overall needs, but for the AAA space, it does tend to devalue things and lower the overall bar of quality. On to the next studio now, BioWare. These guys had huge hits in the past with the Mass Effect and Dragon Age franchises, but after Inquisition they had a couple of big scale flops and it felt like they kind of lost their mojo. Both Anthem and Andromeda tarnished their reputation for a long time, but they have recently released a new Dragon Age game, Veilguard. I think this is a great game to talk about when discussing modern AAA RPGs for a host of different reasons. First off, it's a sequel to a game that's a full decade old, giving us a great example of just how long players are often left waiting these days. For Dragon Age fans, it's been years and years of waiting to see what happens next, especially seeing as Inquisition kind of ended on a bit of a cliffhanger, and all this time left waiting gave players time to build the perfect sequel in their mind, which meant that, in some aspects, the actual game was always going to fall short. Overall though, the game was reviewed positively by mainstream outlets. Not seen as perfect by any means, but overall viewed as a positive addition to the franchise. Some people, myself included, preferred the old art style to this new one they went with, especially where the Kunari are involved. And while the combat was often seen as an overall improvement, depending on the class you played as, your experience could really vary. These sort of complaints led to the game generally being rated as a 7 or 8 out of 10. Still very much a good score, but also shows that the game is not without its flaws. But of course, not every review of the game was like that. For many negative reviews, the one dreaded word that appeared again and again was woke. Oh boy, I was not looking forward to ever talking about this, but it does need to be addressed when talking about the modern gaming space. Because let's face it, there's a very loud group of gamers who just seem to be in the hobby to complain about the fact that not every character is a straight white cis guy. If you're as chronically online as I am, you've likely already seen the woke games list and have a pretty good idea of just how dumb this rabbit hole can get. For far too many people, whether a game is good or bad has no basis on the actual quality of the game, and this makes it a lot harder to judge modern games based on opinions of those online. I'm sure there will be some people who clicked on this video because they believe AAA RPGs are all dead because of wokeness, but I want to make it 100% clear that I do not believe in this. By the ridiculously broad definition of what woke is, Pretty much every RPG ever made could be dismissed for being too woke, but this is clearly stupid. Playing as a female protagonist does not make a game bad. A side character being gay does not make a game bad. A trans person appearing in the game does not somehow magically make the game bad. Gameplay, writing, graphics, soundtrack, these are the sorts of things which can make or break a game, and none of them are dependent on the sexuality, gender or race of a character. Overall, I'd say that Dragon Age the Veilguard is a solid game, and a good example that the AAA RPG industry isn't dead. And now let's talk about Bethesda. Oh boy, I could make a whole video just talking about this one company, because they have had a real journey this century. From Morrowind up until Fallout 4, the games were being reviewed positively, and the overall opinion of the company to most people was very favourable. Sure, every game had its critics, but a Bethesda RPG was something to look forward to. And then came along Fallout 76. Now look, I genuinely like this game. Even at launch, I had a good time with it. But that doesn't mean it was flawless, doesn't even mean it was good. Fallout 76 was a bad launch. A historically bad launch in fact. So much so that it still gets brought up several years later. While the game has improved drastically over the years, so much so now that I can recommend it to the average gamer, it still very much tarnished Bethesda's reputation. There had already been some growing resentment within the community, because nobody hates Bethesda as much as Bethesda fans, but it all seemed to unleash when this game came out. For anyone who had been getting worked up over the years, they suddenly had a reason to let their anger out, and actually have the majority agree with them for once. With this one release, the overall opinion of Bethesda had done a 180, but there was still hope. Sure, 76 had done a fair bit of harm, but it wasn't a traditional single-player RPG, so maybe it was just an outlier. And then along came Starfield. Hey look, it's a traditional single-player RPG! Everything will be fine now, right? Right? So Starfield isn't a terrible game, but boy is it not as good as their old games. While it has plenty of redeeming factors like the shipbuilding, some of the characters and a couple of the quest lines, it has just as many flaws, possibly more. Between the empty worlds, lack of meaningful choices, and absolutely no true uniques, the game quickly grew stale and has failed to keep the same kind of community that both Fallout and the Elder Scrolls have held onto throughout these years. In the past, we'd get a Bethesda game every few years, but now it's looking more like 5+ years at best. With this added wait time, we can't really just look at these two games as blips. If we take Fallout 4 as their last good game, which I'm sure some of you would like to argue about, then it's nearly been a decade since Bethesda gave us something good. And for a lot of players, this makes them believe it's the end. But keep in mind that it was a decade that BioWare also had to wait before releasing their next favourably reviewed game, so maybe there's still hope. Not exactly the most positive look at AAA studios, was it? Felt like the overall vibe was, sure, things are worse now, but it's not as bad as it could be. So instead, let's take a quick look at a few developers who are maybe not AAA. I mean, once again, there's no real definition, so I'm just picking some companies which often seem to be getting referred to as AA instead. Larian Studios, From Software, and Obsidian. Now these are some positively viewed companies. For those not familiar, we're looking at the developers behind Fallout New Vegas, Baldur's Gate 3, and the Soulsborne games. These studios are highly regarded, namely because they've each made a super popular game. All it really takes is one masterful release, and a company's reputation can be set for years, providing they don't also release an utter bomb. Personally, the next RPG I'm looking forward to is Avowed, currently being developed by Obsidian. I think for a lot of us, it feels more sensible to put up hopes in AA developers over AAA ones. Just feels like it's a safer bet to get a solid, focused game from these sorts of teams. And if we want to take a look at the most recently released role-playing games I've been enjoying, then we're going to have to dip into the indie scene. My Time at Samrock and Chained Echoes are the best new releases I've played in a long time. My Time at Samrock is the follow-up to My Time at Portia, and it's a perfect example of how to make a sequel. It improves upon the previous entry while giving a compelling story, interesting characters, and a brand new setting. It truly is a masterclass in how to make a sequel. It's not about completely reinventing the wheel, but instead about improving what you already had to work with, and doubling down on what made the previous game a success. And then we have Chained Echoes, which is not only one of the best games I have ever played, but was also a solo dev project. That's right, in a time where we're getting let down by entire teams, this one guy is able to completely knock it out of the park and create a brilliant game which is better than almost every mainstream RPG we've had for years. Seriously, check out Chained Echoes. You will not regret it, especially as it's cheaper than a big studio game. And while we're on the subject of price, I think this is another area where the smaller studios have the advantage. You pay 60 or 70 quid for a big studio game, so that's the value you expect. But with a small studio or indie dev, you're often paying half that or less. Recently I was lucky enough to be gifted a copy of a game called Map of Materials. It's a short little survival RPG set in a small map of varied biomes. And honestly, it's not that good. The mechanics can be a little clunky, and you can see that visually it's below the standard of the modern game, and it's very clearly low budget in every sense of the term. But it still manages to be decent value for money. The game is less than a $5 at full price, and it has plenty of charm to it. From the design of a top-end sword, to the fact you can catch fish in glass jars, to the ultimate goal being catapulting yourself over a lake, there's still a lot to love about this game. And in an industry where bigger is better seems to be the thought process of the large studios, it's refreshing to play a game which is nice and short. It shows you all the cool stuff, tells a compact little story, and doesn't overstay its welcome. For a big studio, the focus is on making a huge game, and then if it flops, it's a huge loss. But with a smaller studio, there doesn't have to be so much risk on a single project, and these smaller games can be allowed to exist. Overall, I think we're in a time where the smaller studios can really thrive. RPGs are all about storytelling, and the best stories don't come from companies, they come from people. Game studios are not people. They may have people working for them, but ultimately they're companies, and what they care about is making money. The people making the games have stories to tell, and if they're allowed to do so, then we can get brilliant things. But when the driving force isn't creative but is instead capitalistic, then we can't be surprised that so many big games end up feeling soulless. Before I wrap things up here, I do want to talk a little more about individuals within the gaming space. Because while I do think it's important to note that it is individual creators who are responsible for making the games we love what they are, I also see a lot of talk online about individual developers, which kind of gets everything wrong, and assumes the entire success or failure of a AAA game is down to one person. And to cover this, I want to look at two well-known developers. The first who gets too much credit, and the other who everyone just seems to hate. First up is Josh Sawyer, current studio design director at Obsidian, and possibly most well known as the director for Fallout New Vegas. Now, it is undeniable that he had a big impact on Fallout New Vegas, and he most certainly does deserve some credit for the game becoming the beloved classic that it is today. But he doesn't seem to deserve quite as much credit as the internet likes to give him. And this isn't just me saying this, the man himself has had to state this sort of opinion publicly, because it really does happen that much. This here is a Twitter thread where he goes over the many other developers who worked on things that he keeps getting sole attribution for, and also clearing up what it is he specifically did within New Vegas. And I love this thread. There's often a bit of a lack of clarity on who is responsible for what decision when it comes to game design, and I really wish we knew more from the behind the scenes of it all. Especially when we take a look at the internet's favourite writer to hate on, Emil Pagliarulo. So for a lot of people online, the entire reason that Bethesda games aren't particularly good anymore is because Emil exists. The fact that he's been working for the company for over 20 years now and has worked on beloved games like Oblivion, Fallout 3 and Skyrim often gets overlooked, and instead the focus gets put squarely on when he says something a little stupid or just not well thought out. Which, to be fair, does happen a little too often. The main thing that seems to have landed Emil in the crosshairs of the gaming public is his eagerness with which to talk about the games he works on casually, without much thought as to what exactly he should say, and without considering how the internet will consume the words. Most of the quotes that people hate him for are ones taken out of context and slapped on a headline to get easy views. But because of this, the general idea around the internet is that if the writing in a modern Bethesda game is seen as bad, he must have done it. If it's seen as good, then he must have had nothing to do with it. I can assure you that it's not going to be anywhere near as simple as this. I can confidently stake just about anything on the fact that Emil has done both bad and good writing throughout his career, because that's what people do. I'm already dreading the comments on this video, but I'm sure me seemingly defending Emil here will be the nail in the coffin. Even though I've not actually complimented him in any way, and the entire point I'm making is just that he isn't single-handedly bringing down the studio. When looking at a development team of any real size, both the rewards and the consequences are shared. If your team makes an amazing game, then it's not all because of you, but chances are you helped achieve this. If the game turns out badly, then guess what? One person isn't solely to blame, but it still could be the case that they made some bad decisions which made the game worse. Online discourse feels like it's at an all-time low to me, which is why I wanted to make this video with a somewhat more nuanced take on things than your standard reactionary channel would provide. Yes, things are in a kinda bad place now in the AAA RPG world, we can all acknowledge that. But no, it doesn't mean the section of the industry is dead. We still can have good games come out, made by talented individuals who care about what they do. But with all the layoffs, rise of AI, and constant drive by executives to turn every game studio into a money-making machine rather than a creative endeavour, things sure do look bad. The games industry is in a weird space right now, but all hope is not lost. We still have good games coming out, and that's not suddenly about to stop. How many of these games we get really depends on the companies. If we keep seeing super high budget projects that are seen as a product first and foremost, then I have little hope for them. If you make a game with the idea of how to monetize it at the front of your mind, rather than the story you want to tell, then it's no surprise when players feel ripped off. But if we can reach a point where companies realise that the best thing for the industry is to let it be a creative space, then we can go back to the golden age. One where we have a masterpiece of a role-playing game to be released every single year, by a team who got to tell the story they wanted their way. And if this doesn't happen, at least we still have the independent studios to keep making the good stuff. Thank you all for sticking around for this rather long conversation about the gaming industry. I really do hope you enjoyed listening to my thoughts, and have left your own in the comments below. If you want to support bigger videos like these, you can do so by heading to my Patreon page. It's linked in the description below, and with it you get your name in the end cards and monthly wallpapers for phone and PC. If you don't have the money to spare but still want to support, you can always make sure to just like and subscribe. As always, thanks for watching. Sarge out.